Credit card companies balk at adding a new merchant code for gun stores as Republican lawmakers push back on the idea. Plus, Ashley Hlebinsky on what she hopes to accomplish with the University of Wyoming's new Firearms Research Center. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date on what's going on with guns in America. You can also buy a membership if you want to get exclusive access to most of our analysis pieces that give you deeper insight into those issues and also help support our reporting. We are a completely member-funded publication owned 100% by myself, and we are aiming to keep it that way. Independent and informed, sober and serious firearms reporting is what we go for. This week on the podcast, we are going to be talking to a special guest, Ashley Hlebinsky from the University of Wyoming's Firearms Research Center, a co-founder. Welcome to the show, Ashley. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, though I'm a little bit worried about the serious part of your mission.
Could you tell people just a little bit about yourself who might not know who you are?
Yeah, so I am a firearms historian that focuses in museum studies.
That's pretty serious.
Yeah, I guess so, but I don't know. I have fun with it. I'm most well known for the fact that I was the curator in charge of the Cody Firearms Museum, which is one of the largest gun museums in the country.
Yes.
And I was there for about a decade. And during that time, we completely gutted and rebuilt the museum. So we were responsible for everything. I was the project director, so I was responsible for working with my team, everything from content to fundraising to actual project management work to some extent. And so we worked on that, and that reopened in 2019. And since then, I've been consulting full time. So I'm still a museum consultant. I work for museums that have firearms and related collections, because there's not a lot of people in the museum field that have any specialty within that. And then I do some writing. Periodically, I produce and write TV shows. And then, for the past, I think it's been 2 years, I've been working with a Second Amendment scholar, George Moxery, on the development of the University of Wyoming College of Law's Firearms Research Center, which we got faculty approval on last summer. And we ran a press release about it in January of this year.
Yes, brand new program there. But Cody Firearms Museum is also one of the most renowned museums in the country for guns, right? Actually, I believe I haven't been there yet. I'd like to go and check it out, because I hear great things all the time about the displays there. But and I actually was in one, I believe, because you guys displayed the Time Magazine Guns in America cover.
And that's still there.
Yeah, so I guess I'm already there in at least in display.
That was more controversial than I thought it was going to be.
Really?
Yeah. So the Cody Firearms Museum, we get about 200,000 people through the door every year, because it's a part of a larger organization, and we're on the East Gate of Yellowstone. And when we were doing our preliminary survey work, we actually learned that about half of our audience really didn't know anything about guns. So half of the audience are gun people, or either collect or like guns, or casually, target shoot, that kind of thing. And then half of the people identified as really having nothing to do with firearms, maybe even had a fear of firearms. And so when we rebuilt the museum, we felt really strongly that we needed to speak to everyone, that this wasn't just a by the collector for the collector museum. So when we were working on it, we actually had a panel of people, everything from, your gun aficionado, your guy who loves gun, to people who hate guns. And so that was kind of, we were trying to get that delicate balance. And the Time Magazine mural, was a pretty good balance, right?
Yeah.
It was, with 250 people, something like that, across the gun debate. And it was pretty evenly split. And to us, that was like one of the first times we had seen something like that. And so we had this big wall that we needed to do something with. And so actually the curator now, who was my assistant curator back then, came in and was like, hey, we should consider this. And so we put it up. And it has been amazing for discussion. But I will say there are some gun guys that refuse to set foot in the museum because that mural is there.
Oh,
So
interesting.
you're a part of a Cody Firearms Museum controversy.
Well, for those watching on YouTube, you can. So I was on the cover of that magazine alongside, obviously, there's other 250 people, but on YouTube you can see in the background here a copy of that cover, and I thought that issue was really great because it did bring together a lot of people from a lot of different points of view, and didn't really try to editorialize much on any of them. It was mainly just sharing their stories. And they have a website you can still go to that where you can click on each individual person. And it's this sort of moving mural because it's a picture, but it's also a video. If you go to their Guns in America website on Time Magazine's website, and you can listen to interview recording with every single person who's on the cover, and just they share their point of view and their understanding. And I think that's fascinating. And they had people from all walks of life, politicians. I think Steve Scalise is on there, if I remember, Gabby Giffords, all the way from, competitive shooters to hunters to just regular gun owners, and then different kinds of gun control activists as well. So I thought they, like you, that they did a pretty fantastic job of being fair to everyone.
Yeah.
So,
well, and the other thing that I thought was interesting with it is it's not just one side are all the gun control people and one side were all the gun rights people. When you actually look at it, everyone's interspersed within the mural. So it was, we love having it there. It's still there. Danny says that, every time someone complains about it, it's staying up 6 months longer.
Nice. Yeah, they did a bunch of displays of that all around the country. They put giant versions of it up on buildings and stuff in New York City, and they had showings of it around. But I think Cody's the only one that has the permanent display that's still ongoing with that, I believe. But,
and ours is just the image. We didn't have the space where it's at. It's actually in our timeline of firearms history. So we have it in there. And so we didn't have enough, depth in order to do the projector screen for it. So it's just kind of the static image that you got on the cover of it. But it's very large. You have to go because it's a very big wall.
I will. I have to go anyway. It seems like such a fascinating museum. And we'll talk more about that part of what you do, I think, later on in the show. But I wanted to get into, starting off here, what's going on with the Firearms Research Center, because that's a new project that is pretty interesting and pretty unique in the academic world, right?
Yeah, there have been several firearms research centers that have popped up around the country over the past few years. And this started kind of as an inspiration from George Moxery. I mean, he's written the case law books with several other academic scholars on firearms and the Second Amendment. And so I honestly can't remember how he and I got connected, but I know the first time we met was actually in Cody. And so, we connected because George focuses so much on law, and he hopes the research center will produce, firearms lawyers, and that's not just Second Amendment litigators. That's everything within, the understanding and study of firearms. And since I come from a much more historical perspective, a material cultures perspective, we thought that, our personalities and our expertise might balance things out, because a lot of the research centers, other research centers, are very focused in either law or one subject matter. And so we figured, this is something that might be housed in the College of Law, but we want it to be much bigger than that. And we want to encourage, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, education, the education department, so that we can get the most holistic approach to understanding firearms in American culture. And we're obviously the beginning of that. So that's the lofty goal. But we've got, our two very different personalities trying to pull it all together. And so we've been doing some smaller scale things. George has done some CLEs, continuing legal education. He did one on hunting and conservation last fall. We have a lecture coming up in April from Nick Johnson, who specializes in race and firearms laws. And so we're doing some of these small things. We also do a home and away program with Duke, their Firearms Law Center. So
okay.
one year we host it, then they host it. So this year's our turn. And so we try to work with as many, groups of people as possible. So we're starting to create the plan so it's concrete. And George is actually teaching a firearms and Second Amendment course next fall.
Wow, that's pretty interesting. So go down the line with this. What are some of the things you hope to do in addition to some of these events that you've already got scheduled? What are your grand vision? Obviously you mentioned what you're hoping to accomplish. How are you hoping to accomplish that? What are some of the events you're trying to schedule down the line? Like, what do you want to grow into?
My background has always been very much, how do we apply this academic theory to real world scenarios? And so a lot of times when you look at the university structure, it feels very, at a distance, or kind of something that a lot of people don't feel like, okay, well, how can I apply this directly to my conversations, my understanding, especially in terms of how, political the gun debate can be. So we really want to see, the practical application side of what we do, as well as the cultivation of new scholars. And so the way that we're going about doing that, and we'll grow it, is we're actually currently working on a website. We do have a website that's live now, firearmsresearchcenter.org, but it's going to grow. And one of the things that will have is kind of a tab for all of the scholarship we can aggregate. So there are a lot of scholars around the country that do work, but they're siloed. So we want to bring them all together and have a one-stop shop for people who are looking for firearms content from a range of different disciplines. And that will be something that, yes, of course, is accessible to scholars, but will also be accessible to lawyers, to students, to the media, to the public. So it's something that we want to be kind of an overall resource for anyone who wants to know more, in a way that is not judgmental. We're not couching it in, here's our opinion of it. It's just, here it is, kind of thing. And then it will also have a repository of gun laws. Ultimately, we'd like it to have the actual copy of the gun laws, because I can't remember which case, but there was a judge recently who said, I don't want to just see your writing of the law. I want to see an actual, PDF of the page.
I believe that was Benitez in California.
No, it was actually Benitez wanted the spreadsheet. This was a different judge that wants to see they don't want to just see the quote. They want to actually see the page or the pages where the law is. So we're going to ultimately upload that.
Especially when you're dealing with these older laws, that can be really important to see the actual written text of it. Because there's been several occasions. I remember there was a piece, I think, in Politico that tried to describe one of the founding fathers as like very open to gun restrictions, and they cited a law that he had proposed in Virginia, and they got the reading of the law incorrect. It was a regulation about hunting on other people's property. And they had made it out to be a regulation about taking guns away from someone. And, and then I believe Duke has updated that they have a similar repository of historical laws, but it's mainly just quotes from it. And I've seen situations where Costos Moros, who's a gun rights lawyer out in California, recently had mentioned that one of the excerpts from the laws was a bit off from what the actual law said itself. And so Duke updated, to their credit, the section on that law, but it's, the point is it's important to have the actual first documents, right, for these sorts of things, especially because in the post-Bruin landscape, it's so very important to know exactly what the historical regulations were when judging modern gun laws.
Yeah. And so for us, the website is something, I mean, obviously we'll constantly grow, but it's something we're working on right now. And we'll hope to have at least the preliminary information up in the next 6 weeks, because there's so much going on right now in Second Amendment litigation and in dialogue around firearms. We want it to be, not our, down the road, 5 years from now plan, but here's something right now that you can go to that's a resource. So that's part of it. And then there's also the fact that we want to ultimately be a place where if you want to study firearms, you have a place to go. When I was in college, I had to get creative. I had to do independent studies. You kind of have to get, really broad in what you want to focus in, because you can't always study firearms. And there's no program that says firearms history or even arms and armor. The only thing that may be in existence that I'm unaware of would be art museums. You see that a lot more, readily accessible with art museums looking at firearms from an art perspective. But it's difficult to study the firearms. So the goal for me would be to have a research center where if you're someone that's like, okay, I want to study firearms specifically, then I'm going to go here and I can get a degree. That's down the road, but I can get a degree that emphasizes firearms, or I can come and study in the history department, but then I also have the ability to take firearms related courses, and not just I'm going to do an independent study where I do it on my own, or I'm studying, or I'm in a course about, advertising after the Civil War. And so now I'm going to do that course and then do the research on my own to make it firearms related. So be a place that's much more accessible to students, the future of scholars, because the reality is we need a lot broader of a base of firearms scholars. For so long, it's kind of been like, you've got your non-traditional scholars, your gun collectors, your firearms researchers that don't have the traditional academic degrees. And those people often will produce amazing scholarship. Sometimes I feel like it's silly to say that some YouTube personalities have some of the best primary source scholarship that's out there right now, especially technically speaking. So you get this really good
like
scholarship that can come out of that. What's that? Ian McCollum.
Yes.
And C and Arsenal is another really good one. The Armorer's Bench.
I've had Ian on the show a couple times.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing what they put out there. But
it is.
When you have the non-traditional scholarship, it's sometimes difficult to figure out what's good and what's not. So you kind of have to be around the field enough to know what the vetting system is for that. So you don't have your traditional peer review that you'd get in academia. The problem with academia is the people who study firearms are either few and far between, or, they're in different departments all around the country. So when you are studying something that's firearms related within academia, how do you have successful peer review when you don't have peers? And so there's this real kind of problem within understanding scholarship, where we really have to open our minds to the fact that it doesn't have to be traditional academic scholarship, because there have been many cases of traditional academic scholarship, blowing up in our face. I mean, Arming America is one of the best examples of it, where I'm not even going to try to butcher his last name. I always feel bad. I can't pronounce it. But it was this book about, I believe it was colonial America, on firearms and the actual ownership of firearms. And what happened was it won the Bancroft, which is one of the top awards in the history field. But then when he was challenged on his sources, all of a sudden the sources weren't available. And so in the first time of the history of the Bancroft, it was rescinded. And so you can't say that just because it goes through the PhD peer review system that it's going to be quality, because it's difficult to access the information. And just like this amazing firearms research that can happen on the non-traditional side, we're struggling to figure out how we can make sure to vet that so you don't get FUD lore, kind of as we call it. And so I'm hoping the research center will be able to find a way to join the two in order to, acknowledge that there's different levels of understanding, and then help correct some of those misconceptions on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? Because there can be a lot of, it seems to me as an outsider, someone who doesn't have an advanced degree in firearms history, that there can be, or just an advanced degree generally in a lot of fields, there can be a lot of gatekeeping that goes on, with the implication being that if you don't have the right credentials, then the work you do can't possibly be of value, when really the focus should be on the actual work itself and whether or not it stands on its own, not whether the person who wrote it has, a good resume, right? Like,
Yeah.
certainly that can be a huge problem.
Yeah.
And I think somebody who has done work like you in the museum space and has been hands-on with a lot of actual firearms that are a part of historical tradition in America can have the sort of insight that a professor who has a PhD in American history might not have. Like there's pros and cons to each approach. Ian McCollum's work is another example of this. Like he does some really great historical work despite not being a trained, academic historian, because he actually goes and handles the firearms.
And the ability to go into so many of these collections that a lot of people don't. And it's wonderful. And it's an amazing resource. I mean, he came to Cody all the time, found out stuff about our collections that we didn't know. And recently there have been criticisms of my work because I don't have a PhD or I don't have, 20 peer-reviewed articles. Well, that's because I spent 10 years rebuilding one of the largest firearms museums in the country. And that does give me a lot of experience that I'm finding really disappointingly is getting dismissed. In order to build the museum and write the museum, I had to do the research. And in order to put it in the museum, I had to have it vetted, so that is not necessarily a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Technology and Culture, but that is a peer-reviewed program and system to get a museum built that then, contributes to the education of the public. And so it's disappointing to see that those levels of different kind of the idea of scholarship are getting dismissed as, you don't have a PhD, therefore you don't know what you're talking about, or, because you do look at non-academic sources, then those sources are inherently wrong. It's just, I'm hoping that the research center can kind of help shed light on the importance of having both of us or the both types of scholarship so that we can just have the best information as possible. Because the cool thing about this, and I know sometimes I sound like a broken record and I feel like half the time people don't believe me, but I'm genuine in this. It's not our job to tell you what to think about firearms. It's our job to get as much scholarship out there as possible so people can make their own decisions. And so I'm happy to see a lot more scholarship popping up, especially in the post-Bruin kind of world, because all it does is allow us to have a greater pool of information for decision makers to figure out what is constitutional, what is not constitutional, and then also just ideas for how we can contribute to a productive part of the gun debate, but then also how to reduce violence, how to reduce death by suicide. Having all that information is so helpful. We shouldn't be tearing it down just for the sake of tearing it down. We should be trying to build the base so that people who their jobs are to make the decisions now have an amazing place to pull from in order to make those calls.
Right. Because that's one of the other criticisms that you've had to deal with since opening the center is the neutrality, I guess, of what you're trying to do, right? There's been complaints about the funding of the center. There have been donations from gun companies. How, that people have used to try and say the center is not a valuable source of information or is not going to be. They tried to sort of cut you off before it begins by pointing to the funding sources as a reason not to value your work. How do you respond to that?
What's interesting is that when we first got approved as a formal research center within the University of Wyoming, what was interesting was we didn't have, a lot of money, but we also didn't have money from, the firearms industry, from gun companies. So it's interesting because it's not like we started out that way. Yes, we have donations from firearms companies. I come from the museum world, the nonprofit world. And one of the most, important things to me when we were building Cody, because we did take money from gun companies, is donors don't dictate content. So if you believe in the mission.
Is there any agreement between your the center and donors about what you're going to produce?
Honestly, no, not to some extent. We do have some areres where a donor is contributing to the development of the website, but he has no idea what the content of that website is. He's not involved
Which
in
is
that process.
the key
Yes.
bit, right?
100%. If you look at, gift agreements, they're not saying, and now we have to tell XYZ story. And I've always, at Cody, it was the same thing. If a donor wanted to have that kind of control, we didn't work with that donor. We didn't take that money. And so to think about it too, another component of the research center, which I haven't mentioned, is to, help create lawyers that may work for, gun companies on the other side of that. And so there is, an interest in that small side of our research center. So there are different reasons and different purposes of the research center. And at the same time, other research centers, other institutions take money from, gun control organizations.
Right.
And actually, we've taken some industry money, but as of right now, we haven't taken any money from gun rights organizations. In fact, we've had challenges from, gun people to the creation of the center.
There's been
2 days.
There's been an effort to have, I guess, government oversight of what you produce at the center. There's a bill in the Wyoming legislature to that end.
It's not there anymore. We were able to kill that bill. But 2 days after we ran our press release in January, we found out that there was a bill proposed to impose an oversight committee onto the work the research center was doing. Mm-hmm. And that was a 100% no for George and I. And we made it very clear, if this were to happen, well, one thing is that we could jeopardize our bar accreditation because research centers within College of Laws have to be independent. But on the other side, from an ethical perspective, George and I were ready to be done. We said, if this happens, we're not moving forward with the research center. And that really is unfortunate because we put so much work into it. But, I refuse to be part of a center that would, impose that level of control, that someone would impose that level of control on us. Right. So we're fortunate that we were able to work, through it all, and it did not get implemented. But it's just a great illustration of the fact that, people are perceiving that we're, this gun industry controlled organization when some gun people fought to have us shut down before we even got started, or have us controlled before we even got started. So clearly, we're not doing everything, on that side either. And I think that's actually kind of great that we're, if you're making everybody mad, you're probably working your way as much to the middle as you can. But I was surprised to see that the biggest challenge to our research center was from the gun side and not the gun control side.
Yes, it's certainly interesting. And then going back to the point about other research centers that exist on this issue, certainly they also take funding from groups with points of view. For instance, the Johns Hopkins Center for Prevention of Gun Violence is literally named after Michael Bloomberg, who is the most prominent gun control donor in the country. Duke has, who you work with, I would say that we've had members of Duke on the Duke's Firearms Center on the show. I quote them. I think they're serious people. They engage with the gun laws seriously, but it's fairly clear that they have a certain point of view on things. I don't know how often their writing indicates that a gun law is not constitutional. Just to be honest about what Duke produces in this area. It's serious academic work, but it certainly leans to one side in their perspective. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't think personally. I think that's perfectly fine as long as you're being upfront and your arguments and your work is done in a diligent manner. There's nothing wrong with that. How do you see the University of Wyoming Center? Is it in the same light, or am I off base in looking at it similarly to how I look at Duke?
Well, I think obviously different scholars are going to look at the same information and have different opinions. And
Mhm.
that, we hope will be the case within the research center. And those different opinions can be happening within our own research center. It doesn't have to be just, one side or the
Mm.
other, or, we're all going to be one way. And so we're hoping that when we start to be able to develop more fellows, more researchers within it, that there will be kind of that internal debate within our organization as well. I think that that's incredibly important. I think the one thing that I always would get frustrated with the gun side is that when I would start to talk about history, then I would hear often, I would almost always get cut off. And then people would be like, see, yeah, facts are facts, and you can't argue with facts. And I'm like, well, actually, there's entire fields of study that's all we do, and so it's the acknowledgement that we can all look at the same material and have very different conclusions about what that means. That is so important that I don't think everybody, kind of in a public capacity quite understands. So for us, I mean, we want to cultivate it as much as possible. We're not going to just have scholars that come from one perspective as we start to develop, the researcher component of what we do. But at the same time, I mean, if we're pushing donors don't dictate content, I mean, you have to take people at their word, around the country and, and make your conclusions individually based on that. But I'm hoping to have, as much diversity of thought within our center as we grow as possible. Maybe that doesn't make me super popular, but that's at least, important to me and always has been important to me, despite what people, project onto my belief systems. But what people don't realize is, one side, while the pro-gun control side right now is saying how, insanely biased I am towards guns, they don't realize that I have been called all kinds of names on the other side. I mean, the Cody Museum, we've been called Bolsheviks, and like I said earlier, there are gun people that won't go into the museum because they believe that we are, we have a woke anti-gun agenda. So, what people aren't seeing is that, the middle, we all work great with, right? But sometimes the extremes, they just take one thing in your life and then they, turn it around on you.
Yeah, I think I've certainly experienced some of that myself as someone who founded a publication dedicated to sober, serious conversations about guns and is a CNN contributor, but also a firearms instructor who likes to build AR-15s in his spare time. So I understand where you're coming from on that point for sure. Why don't we talk a little bit more about Cody and your time in the museum world and some of the fun things that you've experienced there. What was maybe some of the most interesting guns that you've come across in your time as a curator?
Oh, goodness. I personally like, if you read any of my expert testimonies that are public, I like, the firearms technology that's far more advanced than we assume was developed, at a particular time. And so some of the most interesting pieces in Cody are ones that, really predate your concept of that invention. One of the ones that I'm going to use that Danny will use often is the Burton light machine rifle. And it's an amazing example of technology ahead of its time, but also how we drive the development of technology. And so the Burton light machine rifle is a selective fire, twin top magazine, detachable magazine firearm that takes an interchangeable cartridge, and is single soldier portable. And it was developed. And if you are aware of the words that I am saying, you will know that in the 1970 manual of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that is how you define an assault rifle. I know I don't make friends when I say those terms, but assault rifle and assault weapon are very different terms.
Yes.
Just an assault rifle is a selective fire gun, unless you're within a state law that changes it. So like California state law actually has a different definition for assault rifle, but the historical one are the words that I just said.
Yes.
So
comes from the Sturmgewehr, right? The literal assault rifle in Germany.
Yeah. So, and that's, so you're talking like 1917 for the Burton. And you're talking the end of World War II for the Sturmgewehr, and then moving on from that. And so we're talking decades, and we're talking a different world war. So he develops this guy named Frank Burton, who was the son of James Burton, who's very a famous designer during the 1800s at Harper's Ferry. So legacy family. And so he's designing this gun, and obviously the hope would be to implement it during the war, but the war ends, so it really doesn't go out of prototype, mode. And that's what you see a lot. Like, you get these really, intricate inventions, and then the war ends and it's like, oh, never mind. And with earlier technology, you'd see that really advanced technology, even rifling in the 1400s, doesn't have a practical battlefield application. So it becomes a civilian, kind of a civilian trait within a firearm, a hunting arm, a target shooting arm. And so I'm fascinated by that kind of thing. So the Burton is a great example of that. It's also very popular in the video game world. Cody is the only example, but yet nobody asked us. I think it's Battlefield 1. Damn, I'm going to embarrass you because it's probably not the right. What's also interesting about that is that, and this is where scholarship is, and it's constantly changing, is that there was history about the fact that they used incendiary rounds as well, with the intention to shoot down balloons. However, when you actually look at the manual and all the ammo they use, there's no evidence of that. Oh. So that's been something that was debunked, although I think you can use incendiary rounds in the video game. So there's that piece of technology. There's early magazine technology from the 1600s. We have this really wonky 4-barrel gun that gas seals together from the 1600s that belonged to the Earl of Meath in Scotland. Wow. So it's seeing that this is not just a linear narrative of you have a hand cannon, then you have a matchlock, then you have a wheel lock, and then you have multiple variations on a flintlock, and then a percussion, and so on and so on. So at the museum, we put a timeline in that started with our earliest crossbow, and then went all the way up through modern day, and we actually have 3D printed guns in the museum, and that was a fascinating process. So we started with the oldest, and then on the one side, it's the development of the firearm, the overarching linear narrative, and on the other side, it's, hey, here's the same time frame, and here's all these other technologies that existed and why they were important for this part of the culture or not, so that you could see the yin and yang almost of it. And so that's probably the most significant thing for me, especially when you look at collection pieces, because where some of these things are commissioned or one-offs, because, again, it's a civilian, firearm for the most part, especially over in Europe. Right. They're one-offs. But let's think about the fact that, maybe they're not always one-offs because they survived. You've got how many surviving guns that were produced for a specific military contract. It could be a lot, it could not be. But then you say, here's one gun that belonged to one person because he had a commission. How did it survive 400 years? Mm-hmm. And that's actually, I think, is something I'm recently kind of starting to think about. It's fascinating that those are what survived, and why would they have survived, and how did they survive? And a lot of them have been passed down by collectors. So right. The person who had it built was an avid gun owner and collector, and then they pass it down the line. But that part is also interesting, is these things that maybe weren't made in mass somehow survive for us to see them for the most part.
That's very fascinating. I mean, there's there's a lot of history to guns, right? It goes back such a long time, and there's been so many different developments over the years, and whether they catch on or when they catch on is pretty fascinating to look at too. But one of the things you mentioned is obviously the influence of video games and presumably other media. Like, how much during your time at Cody did you see people starting to come in because of games like Battlefield 1 or any of the video games that focus on realistic firearms, especially historical firearms, and even shows like you're right by Yellowstone, right? So what about Yellowstone? Has that driven people to come into the Cody Museum more? These sort of media properties or these cultural events, do you see an impact in people coming to the museum because of that?
For sure. We actually have several sections dedicated to kind of the pop culture understanding of firearms, especially with the Western, and starting with, dime novels and Buffalo Bill's Wild West up through modern Westerns. Danny's made a mission of his to put the Mauser C96 in as many displays as possible. So you do see it in the the Western display. And it is relevant to that. But you do get that a lot. I mean, and what's interesting is the video game crowd is a much different crowd. And so a lot of times it's a younger crowd. And they come in and they sometimes know details about firearms that I never even knew existed. Although it's not always correct, right? Like I mentioned with the
Right.
with the Burton, but they come in and have this very technical, desire. And then people who come in for TV shows often want to see, we have many guns from earlier Westerns, Gary Cooper firearms, and they want to come and see that particular firearm that one of their favorite celebrities held. And then we also have to do a lot of debunking within the museum of the way that they operated, how they operated,
Yeah.
how they would have actually been used within that time frame. But we do see that, and we did notice in general. We did, pre-survey work of the museum, and then we did post-survey work of the museum, and we actually shifted our demographic a lot to younger audiences
Really?
and a much more female audience. Danny, I remember right after we opened, he's like, I saw something I'd never seen before. It was a couple, and the woman was dragging the man around the museum, and he was just done. And he was the guy, he was the gun person, and she was just so fascinated by all that, because we did a lot of contextual history. It wasn't just guns on a wall like the former Cody Firearms Museum was. And so we saw just that change in general about the people who wanted to be in there. The reporter from the Wall Street Journal, when he came in to review the museum, he had actually reviewed the Buffalo Bill Museum, which is a part of the conflict or the complex before. And in that review, he also did not say some very nice things about the old Firearms Museum. So he came out to review the new Firearms Museum, and he's totally right. Like he was, yeah. Like I don't, judge him for those opinions at all, because I felt them too. So when he came out to the museum, the first thing he said to me, we had part of the gallery open. It was right before the formal opening, and he walked in and he looked at me and he goes, "People are talking." He's like, "When I was here before, it was like silence." He was like, and everyone, it was just a bunch of dudes staring at the cases. And he's like, and no one was having a dialogue. And he's like, there are women and families in here. And he's like, and he walked around without me, for a while too. And he's like, it's amazing to see the change in the conversation. And that was just like, to me, that was the most important thing that could have happened, in what we were trying to do, which was to facilitate the dialogue. And so it was great to have someone who had been to the other museum, not liked it, and then come in and really had a lot of favorable things to say about it.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see to hear that the demographic changed like that over time. And especially with the rise of, especially the way that a lot of video games implement firearms now, like, historical games like Battlefield 1 is actually a really good example of it, because they'll often try to find extremely unique guns, even one-off guns that have more advanced features like the Burton you're talking about, so that they can actually put them in the game, and you can use what's effectively an assault rifle in a World War I video game, and it's not inaccurate to the time, in the sense that gun did exist at least.
Yeah.
But so they sort of dredge up a lot of these guns that people don't know about to put them in their games. So it's interesting to see that driving people to actually go and seek out the real history of these things, because they're not always used historically accurately in a video game, of course, or in a movie or a TV show. And so it's interesting to see people respond to that by going in to the museum to actually see them, and then you being able to sort of give them that extra level of information to maybe debunk some of the things that are out there and help them learn a little bit more about the history.
I remember when I did an interview for PBS NewsHour, this woman got so mad at me. I was a gun person. So we were standing in front of the polymer kind of revolution section of the timeline. And we were talking about, the AR-15, the AR-10, and we were standing in front of several early AR-15s, and we weren't talking about, I don't think we were talking about it, but it didn't make it into it. selective fire AR-15s. But we were talking about the terminology, understanding, the legislative definitions of quote unquote assault weapons, all of that.
Right.
And she like lost her mind on my social media and was like, how dare you stand in front of a display that has nothing to do with, automatic firearms. These are semi-automatic firearms. AR-15s were never, selective fire. And I was literally standing in front of the early examples. People don't realize that there were early examples before they were adopted or sold by, Colt. And so I was just funny because it's like, it was funny to me because I was like, I'm actually standing in front of the few examples that exist of a selective fire AR-15. And there was so much of that like hatred projected of like, how could you stand in front of these things? And I'm like, ironically, I was in front of a case where there was something that totally debunks what a lot of people associate with that early technology. And I thought that was funny.
Yeah.
I couldn't win the argument though. She didn't want to hear it.
Of course. Well, and that's how you see the gun politics knock up against, the history of firearms, right? Because it's an important distinction now for people to make that the AR-15 as it exists in mass production is a semi-automatic rifle because, a lot of people think it is fully automatic, that your average AR-15,
yeah, exactly.
And they don't understand that. And so people can get stuck in, they know the fact that the AR-15 you can go out and buy today is going to be semi-automatic only, but that doesn't mean there never existed any select fire AR-15s.
Yeah, well, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, in the Oregon measure 114, there's a sentence about a semi-automatic, and I think they use the term assault rifle. And if I remember correctly, they don't have a modified. They don't have the modified definition like in California. I could be wrong, but I don't think they do. And so it was just one of those moments too on the other side where the terminology is changed inaccurately, and ultimately,
it happens much more often on that side.
Yeah, but I remember seeing that and having it really be like, because to me, your wording and your terminology is so important, and I just want people to be able to have the best understanding of the terms. And that was an example on the other side of, I don't know if it was an oxymoron, since, assault rifle is selective fire and they had the semi-automatic and the perception that, of what they were trying to say.
Right.
And it's just, it's both sides of it, but it was really fascinating how difficult it can be to understand that and how easy it is to, make a mistake in general.
Right. And how much the work that you do as a museum curator, as a historian, is inherently political, right? It's going to inherently become political, I guess is what I mean by that. Like, you can't avoid it.
I try, I hate politics. So, but yeah, of course, when you are writing an expert testimony, it's not like, you do your best to just provide the history to the best of your knowledge. I don't personally and professionally make a stance on whether or not you should do this or not, but just you asked me to do a history on this, and here's my interpretation on that history. Mm-hmm. But when you're hired by you're hired by a side. You can't just not be hired by a side. And so when you're hired and you're on the plaintiff's side or the defense's side, there's automatically, even if you're not, your writing doesn't have it, there's a projection, a perception that because you're on a specific side, that therefore, you then stand for X, Y, and Z. So even though you don't necessarily, take a side professionally, you are on a side because that's who hired you. But I think it's really important to
or just that's how the work works. That's how your conclusions come out in the proceeding, because it's going to be, especially in a post-Bruin situation where historical gun laws and historical development of firearms matter so much to whether or not a gun law is constitutional. Whatever you determine in looking at the history of the given period of firearms development is going to be used in a political way, whether you intend it to or not. Yeah,
and that's it's an important thing that I've kind of started really thinking about in my own profession, which is moving forward, are there better ways to help educate. How can we, better educate everyone and earlier in my career, this wasn't necessarily the case. It wasn't so volatile. It wasn't so personal. The perceptions and what's projected. So early on, it was everybody would come and ask me and talk to me. And that's still the case in a lot of respects. But, I'm trying to kind of in my brain be, how can I help the most? Because all I want is to facilitate the dialogue, and I haven't come up with that necessarily the answer yet. But how can you help the most?
Yeah.
Because
hopefully
it
the
can be
Firearms
so
Center.
volatile.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully you'll be able to find better ways to do that through the work of the Firearms Center, and I think we're going to look forward to following that work as things move on here, and perhaps have you back on the show again down the line to talk about how it's developed over time and what you guys are doing once things are moving more at pace, right? You want to get things up and running, and then perhaps come back on the show and talk a little bit more about some of the successes and failures and some of the ways that things worked out and how effective they've been. So we'll have to have you back on again. But in the meantime, where can people go and find out more about the Firearms Research Center if they want to, or more about your writing or your work personally?
So if you want to see more about the Firearms Research Center, especially as we're going to be uploading a lot of content, we're firearmsresearchcenter.org. And then on Instagram and Facebook, we're just at Firearms Research. So you can check us out there. I'm not going to lie, I don't remember the handle for Twitter because at Firearms Research was taken. So just Google it. And for me, if you want to see any of the work that I'm doing, because my work is incredibly diverse, everything from I just wrote a ghost tour and wrote about dark tourism over to the firearms history side of things. I'm at History and Heels on Instagram, and I am at official Ashley Hlebinsky. Have fun spelling that on Facebook.
There's a silent letter in there. I'm not going to tell people what it is, but there's a silent letter in that last name.
People like to add like 2 or 3 other letters into it too.
All right. Well, we appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to us about the new center, and we look forward to hearing from you again in the future.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
All right. It's time for our news update segment with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How are you doing this week, Jake?
I'm doing pretty good, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I was at Columbia University this past Wednesday speaking to a class there. So it's pretty exciting. My first trip up to New York City, and oh my gosh, since like high school, I guess. And then before that, we did the whole like Ellis Island Statue of Liberty trip when I was in middle school sometime. That was before 9/11 actually. But I took the train up Acela that was the first time thing. A lot of firsts on this trip for me. Had the New York pizza and bagels, which were both.
I was going to ask if you got the food while you were there.
Yeah, both worth the effort to go and get. Definitely recommend if anytime you're up in New York City, if you ever make it up there. The food is pretty solid. I liked it a lot. But yeah, I spoke to a class at Columbia University, and we had a great conversation, get back and forth. As a public health class, so they brought me in to talk about the gun rights movement and sort of the political realities surrounding public health efforts to reduce gun deaths. So I thought it went really well.
That's good to hear at a college these days.
Yeah, it was very respectful, back and forth. The students were all, interested in hearing from me and having a discussion. So I always enjoy that atmosphere anytime I'm invited anywhere to speak. So that's usually my philosophy. I'll just go talk to people who want to talk to me. I don't mind what their views are one way or the other on the topic, as long as they're respectful and interested in an open dialogue, and that's what I had. And that I hope they learned a lot. Some of the students there from the conversation, and I'd love to do it again. I've done it before at other schools, Carnegie Mellon, University of Michigan. So always open to those sorts of speaking engagements whenever they can fit into the schedule. And so, yeah, I had a great time, but yeah, you're actually going shooting this weekend, aren't you?
That's right. Yeah, I'm taking a friend who just got his first handgun. So he's pretty excited to get out there and to try it out. And he asked me to come along with him. So we're going to go, spend a day at the range, I believe tomorrow on Saturday.
That's awesome. New shooter time. That's always fun. If you can help people learn the ropes, so to speak, make sure they're following the safety rules and doing all these right things. But yeah, it's always good to go with new shooters. I always find that to be a lot of fun because they're usually very eager to learn, and they want to get better and improve themselves and make themselves a better shot. So good luck. I think that sounds like a fantastic thing. I have some friends who want to do concealed carry courses here in the DMV area, so I have to go schedule some of those soon as well. And then I had the Homes for Our Troops charity shoots. I still have 2 of those to schedule this year for the last couple of charity auctions that we've done. So it's going to be a busy spring and summer and fall, I think, for shooting. I'm also trying to do
it's going to be a lot of shooting.
Yeah, I'm trying to get into some competitive shooting maybe a little bit as well. I know there's a member who lives in Virginia that is trying to help me get involved in some of the local competitive shooting events, just so I can, get out and do that a little more often. I've done it a couple times before, but it's a lot of fun. I'd like to learn a little more of that. Plus, it's good skills, skill building competitions. So, definitely got to get back on the horse with that kind of stuff. So hoping to do a significant amount of actual shooting coming up here, because that's always less than I'd like to be able to do it. You know what I mean?
Right.
But you've got a big story this week that we're going to be talking about here. The credit card companies, the big credit card companies, they made a major decision. What exactly did they do?
Yeah, so Bloomberg actually broke the news Thursday the 9th, as of this recording, that Visa and MasterCard, according to internal sources, said that the MCC code, the merchant category code that everyone was talking about for quote unquote tracking gun sales, which we'll get into a little bit later why that's a bit of a misnomer. But anyway, they were originally going to go forward with this code. They faced a bunch of backlash, a lot of political backlash from gun rights advocates, and now are no longer they're pausing at least the implementation of those codes. And shortly after that announcement, go ahead.
Sorry, you actually, Bloomberg broke this story, but you actually talked directly with Visa and Discovery, right? About their decision not to go forward with this?
That's right. Yeah. So Visa, I reached out to Visa just to kind of corroborate Bloomberg's reporting. And they told me that it was in the face of a bunch of impending legislation through, various states across the country. I believe there's 5 or 6, mostly Republican-led states that are either introducing legislation to outright ban the use of these special gun store codes or severely disincentivize their use. And Visa basically said, in the face of all this uncertainty, it's created a lot of chaos for our legal department. So we're just going to pause the code and see what happens, basically. And then that was also echoed by the other companies as well.
Yeah, pretty big news, because this was a major concern for gun owners and gun rights advocates alike throughout the country. Mainly, I think, because of the impetus behind this change, right? So we can talk a little bit about what it actually does, but the concern was that it'll track gun sales and even perhaps deny gun sales or have people reported to the police, right?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of people thought that this would essentially be like a de facto registry if it was implemented in the way that a lot of its proponents, frankly, thought that it could be used. So, they're not that far off in terms of what the proponents of this move think it's going to do by jumping to that conclusion.
That's how this came about, right? There was a New York Times columnist who suggested this idea of using merchant category codes, which already exist, right? There's hundreds of them that these companies use to put different retailers in different categories. This is how, you get rewards cards, right? So the airlines have a certain merchant category code. And so if you spend money at an airline, that's how your credit card can know that you qualify for the points that they're giving for that recommendation. But the idea behind this wasn't to create, gun buying rewards cards. It was to track gun sales because some mass shooters had used credit cards to purchase guns and ammunition in the lead up to their attacks. So the idea was, well, if we can track these sales and we can identify suspicious patterns of buying, then those consumers can be reported to the police in the same way that, for instance, there's terrorism or fraud, especially fraud monitoring works in this way, where they track suspicious patterns of buying, and then a report is filed with the appropriate authorities to try and investigate this. So the idea was to try and copy that system, and the first step was to implement these merchant category codes. Amalgamated Bank, which is a big union bank, is sort of an activist bank. A lot of the top Democratic officials use that bank for their banking, and it's often trying to implement financial reforms in line with what liberal activists want. And so they were the ones who proposed this change at the international body that governs these category codes. And, it sort of went through. Initially, it was ignored, and then late last year, it went through and caused a lot of uproar because there was initially opposition from Visa and MasterCard and Discover and American Express, because the industry doesn't want the codes, right? The gun industry doesn't want a specialized code, because I think explicitly because of the people who do want the code and what they want to do with it, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. And as you said, for the last few years, it seems a lot of these banks and credit cards have sort of resisted this change. It's sort of mirrors a lot of the same trends that you've seen perhaps in other big industries that have, as of late, pivoted to more, whether you want to call it ESG or more socially conscious policies, where for a while they say, oh, we don't want to dip our toes into this. This is too political. And then suddenly, just out of nowhere, they say, okay, fine, we'll implement your pet project or your social cause, and creates a huge uproar. And as you said, the industry was not happy. Red states, a lot of Republican figures weren't happy with this, and it just creates a big fight and a big blow up. But at least in this case, it seems like that backlash actually, paid some dividends here.
Yeah, it certainly seems like the efforts from Republican lawmakers in places like Florida and Texas to push back on this effort to use legislation to discourage it has actually worked. I think that's one of the big takeaways. I mean, now, to be fair, I suppose they've only said that they've paused this plan.
Right.
They haven't abandoned it. It does seem odd, right, for a financial institution to put a merchant code on an industry that doesn't want the merchant code. The only reason you would do that is because the activists on the other side do want the code, right?
Right.
Those are the only people who want the code, are the ones who want to try and use it to track people. Now, we should note, right, that what the activists want to use this code for and what it can actually do are two different things at this point, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. The MCC doesn't track, granular data. It doesn't tell you what was purchased at a particular store. It doesn't tell you in what quantity something was purchased. It just is a code assigned to a particular retailer that, in this case, may sell guns as part of its business. So, for example, like a Cabela's or something would be flagged by this code, even if you went there to buy, I don't know, camping equipment or something. So it's not exactly the most granular look at what people are doing.
Right. We don't know exactly how that was all going to shake out in terms of like large retailers that also sell guns alongside other sporting goods. But even in retailers that are just literally gun stores, there's a lot of things you can buy from a gun store that aren't guns.
Right.
And so all the code would tell the credit card company is that you bought something from a retailer that sells guns. So, you can spend $5,000 because this is where a lot of the basic concept that the New York Times columnists came up with, and that a lot of gun control activists have run with, sort of falls apart. Because the idea is, well, if you spend $5,000 at a gun store, maybe that's suspicious and should be investigated. I mean, first off, like, I think trying to find a needle in a haystack in terms of somebody who's likely to like, what pattern is there for mass shooters? You look at some of the examples they gave, and it's really, some of these guys just bought a couple of guns and a couple hundred or even a couple thousand rounds of ammunition. That is not an uncommon thing to do if you're a gun owner.
Right.
Like, it's not some suspicious red flag. A lot of people buy a couple guns and a couple thousand rounds of ammunition, and 99.9999999% of them don't turn into mass shooters, if that makes sense. And in addition to that, just spending $5,000 at a gun store, for instance, if you just pick a number, a relatively large number, doesn't even mean you've bought any guns. You could be buying a gun safe or two. And so just having this ability to see for these credit card companies to see how much money you spent at a category of retailer is generally not going to be enough information to create a profile. Plus, it's sort of the base level concept of creating a profile for mass shooters doesn't work either, as we talked about a while back with the United States Secret Service did their report on mass shooters and said there is no profile. That's
right.
Not how this works. So there's a lot of problems with the basic concept. And then what they got is really only a half measure to what they were trying to get to, because in order for it to work the way they even claim that it should work or could work, you'd have to allow the credit card companies to see into the basket, they call it, to see exactly what you're buying when you go to the gun store. Because if you're just buying a gun safe, that's different from buying two $2,000 guns or 10 or 20 $100 guns or whatever. And so it really was a half-baked concept to begin with, one that was only supported by people who aren't retailers.
Right.
And so it's kind of a weird consideration for these companies to begin with. So I'm not really surprised that they eventually came around to not wanting to do this, because it doesn't do what activists say it would do, and it makes everyone else involved upset. So, not shocked that they've decided to go back on it, but they were going to go through with it, right? After that, after the governing body said they were implementing it, all these card companies said they would go forward, and now they're saying they're not.
That's right. Yeah. And Discover, in fact, even was going to implement its code as early as next month in April. And so they actually are the only ones that actually had a code ready to go. And even they said, you know what, this isn't worth the trouble. We're pausing and we're going to join all these other companies because this is just getting out of hand.
Yeah. And, American Express will be an interesting one to watch too, because American Express is different from the other credit card companies in that they don't just provide the network. They also provide basically the banking side of things. So they are the bank in addition to being the credit card company. So they can see what you're buying, like your bank can see it. So they know what's in your cart. Now, they don't really need an MCC code to do that, because your bank can already see what you buy, right? They know where you're buying from and what you're buying. The credit card company, the processor, doesn't know this, but your bank does. And American Express is a combination of those two things. And so what they decide to do will be a little more interesting as well, I think. But we'll have to keep an eye on this whole situation. I mean, are they going to just pause it, or are they going to give up on entirely? That's another big question.
Yeah, that is the key, I think.
Yeah. But we will absolutely keep an eye on that. And I hope you have fun this weekend, taking your friend out to shoot for the first time. I think that sounds fantastic. But for now, that's all we have for you. If you want to help support our reporting here at The Reload, you can head on over to thereload.com. You can sign up for our free newsletter, or you can purchase a membership. That's how we fund our reporting. That's how we are able to do this. That's how we're able to bring sober, serious reporting to you on a weekly, really daily basis. And you can also, if you're not ready to purchase a membership, support us by rating this podcast on whatever app you're listening to it on, or going and liking it on YouTube, leaving a comment, leaving a review, sharing it with your friends. All of that helps us out, and we greatly appreciate it. So please, please, please go ahead and do those things, and we will be back with you again next week.